Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are facing a bill where you have to realize that it's not insignificant, a bill on the Elections Act. The Elections Act is the hinge on which weighs our parliamentary legitimacy. This legitimacy, which is the people's electives and that of the government as well. First, they're tabling this important bill 48 hours before the end of a session with a gag order. Bravo. That's really good for a debate. They're saying they want to facilitate election participation. There seems to be some justified obsession with this bill. And the Elections Act, federally, is one of the most permissive, as they say, in terms of the ability to be able to go vote, as I was saying earlier. But yes, this is an important bill that is fundamental for the legitimacy of parliamentary democracy. And they're tabling this with a gag order. They don't want more discussions on it. And people will head off to vacation. And we think these people, over the holidays, will know what's in this bill. And they think that over the holidays, they'll be looking at media coverage and talking about this bill and detail all of the advantages in it. Mr. Speaker, this is just an insult to the intelligence of parliamentarians and those who have elected us to proceed in this fashion. But that's not all. This bill proposes a delay in the election that was planned for October 20th, 2025, and delays it until October 27th, 2025. And the pretext used for this is an accommodation for a festival of lights that is Indian, that is not a federal holiday or provincial holiday. But at the very bottom of this, well, even though the intentions may be noble, but there seems to be an elephant hidden in the room to allow members, Liberal members of Parliament, because they're the ones who are tabling this bill, 22 Liberal members, 3 ministers, to be able to receive their pension because they were missing 1 day of work to be eligible for this pension. This is the real motivation behind this. And when you have a little bit of respect, well, even though in my opinion, we should not subject the rule of law to religion. When you do respect religion, you don't instrumentalize beliefs for pension benefits. And that is what this government, at the end of its power, seems to be doing by tabling such an important bill. And we could even remove this section. And the problem is, even if I want to move an amendment, the Conservative amendment doesn't allow us to table a sub-amendment. So that is why, Mr. Speaker, we will be voting against this legislation. We cannot support such a maneuver which insults the intelligence of Canadians. Mr. Speaker, if there had just been 1 day to go vote, 1 day only to go vote with 2 early voting days or advanced days, we could say perhaps we should be able to see what we can do. But no. Right now, and if you add the 2 extra days under C-65, there's 6 6 early advanced polling days. You can't see this anywhere else. 6 advanced polling days. And how come we'll have 6 days? Because voters have developed their habit of going to vote before voting day. And then with also the actual voting day, there's 7 days. So not only there are 6 advanced voting days, you can vote any day at the returning officer's location. Then they're saying there's a festival of lights and it will hinder the ability of these people on election day to go vote. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. They can also go vote through the mail. And then they're saying, no, we have to make an accommodation here. We have to really subordinate the rule of law to religion because there's a religious holiday. That is illogical, Mr. Speaker, and that's how I'm saying it's a lack of respect for the intelligence of our voters, because when you can vote 6 days in advance, in addition to the actual voting day, when you can vote any day at the returning office or vote through the mail, and there are also roaming voting places for people with reduced mobility, and also in nursing homes. Don't tell me that we're limiting accessibility to voting. What else could you ask for more? For the next Elections Act, we'll be adding 2 extra early voting days, advanced polling days. So the actual voting day is no longer the only day when people can go vote. And then they're saying, well, we have to delay it by a week. Well, what does this do? This 1 week delay. It proves there's a lack of consideration that this government has for democracy municipally. In Quebec, Mr. Speaker, there will be more than 1,100 municipalities that will be having their elections only 6 days before this. And in 2021, their turnout rate dropped by 6% because there was a federal election at the same time. But that ended much earlier than the municipal votes, which also took place at a set date. They can't say that they didn't know that there were municipal elections in Quebec for more than 1,100 or more or less municipalities. It's not because they don't know the date. It's a set date. It comes up at the same time. So there's a real lack of consideration, Mr. Speaker, because there are municipalities in 2021 where the turnout rate for voting was so low, even as low as 18%.
We need to consider municipal governance not as some kind of administrative extension of the government of Quebec. We need to treat municipal governments as governments in their own right, local government. So how is it that the chief electoral officer, how will the chief electoral officer do something logistically to find space for voting, for example? Can you explain that to me? It's going to be quite the experience. In 2021, things were already difficult. It was a complete mess. And now, the returning officer is going to have to compete with municipal returning officers? And will we really be able to access municipal spaces for the election? No. Already in Quebec, there were difficulties for advanced voting to get space in schools for that. That's a reality. And yet, these people across the way are telling us that it's because we want to accommodate the Festival of Lights. Well, I can say this decision wasn't very enlightened, if you'll pardon the pun. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are some good things in this bill. The problem is that this bill seems to be obsessed with accessing the vote, and they're so obsessed that they're forgetting that there needs to be an appropriate balance between preserving the integrity of the voting process and then accessing the voting process. Now, if this bill carefully elaborated that there are polling places in schools or in post-secondary educational institutions, that there will be, say, 2 additional days of advanced polling, that they want to make it easier to have polling offices in certain locations, that we need better tools to counter foreign interference, and to ensure that we have a process that is protected from this kind of interference. If that were the case, well, of course, the Bloc Québécois would say that that's a good idea. But what about municipal elections, Mr. Speaker? Aren't municipal elections important? Did you know that in 2017, there was a 44.7 turnout rate? In 2021, it was only 38.6. And in Quebec, in 2008, we should look back to the past and look for the lessons of history, because that's very important. In 2008, there was a federal election. And the government of Jean Charest in Quebec said that the elections would be 6 days after the federal election. And the turnout rate in Quebec, which was usually between 78 and 81%, plummeted to a mere 57%. Now, some people said some might say that he was just trying to take advantage of this to get more control. He was putting forth an economy first message, even though things were actually going poorly. And so Jean Charest didn't want to have to face up to that reality in an election, so he triggered elections. But we have fixed date elections here. So unless this government unless this government gets toppled after it presents the budget next spring, well, we're going to have our set election date. But in C-65, it says that the chief electoral officer can accommodate certain things if that election date harms the municipal election process. It's in the bill. But instead of thinking about that, they've chosen to consider a religious festival, the Festival of Lights, to the detriment of municipal democracy. Yes, I heard what was said earlier about Alberta, and that will also be the case in Quebec. It seems to be that if your priorities were if your heart was in the right place, if you had the right priorities, you wouldn't set the rule of law above religious concerns, especially when this holiday is not even recognized as a statutory holiday. And if we looked at all of the religious holidays that different communities have, it might be quite difficult to even find a date. And this is going to set a precedent. If you tried to accommodate every religious holiday, there would be issues. No one's even asking for it. These communities aren't even asking for that to be accommodated. And with good reason, because they're not going to lose their right to vote, because there are many other ways of voting. They can vote by mail, for example. And indeed, this bill was going to enable opportunities to improve the conditions for that. This makes no sense. But what we can see, what actually makes sense about this, is that this government has instrumentalized a religious holiday for purely pecuniary advantage, for financial benefit. And then we wonder why people are cynical about politicians. We wonder why people don't want to vote. Do we really think, Mr. Speaker, do we really think that there will even be enough street polls to post the posters of all of the municipal and federal parties and candidates? Everything's going to be going on at the same time. We're barely even going to be able to post signs. It's going to be a complete mess and debacle. It would have been better to make more room. It would have been better for this bill to give the chief electoral officer the leeway that he needs between now and the election to prepare elections that will be carried out appropriately and without undue complications, because there will be logistical problems on the ground, insurmountable problems on the ground. You just have to think about it on a purely logistical level. Returning officers were having great difficulty in the last election. If I have any here left at the next election, I'll be doing the same. So for all these reasons, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois, if there are no further guarantees that something will be done about this, there's no question of our supporting this bill, even at this stage, because this is simply not acceptable.
A commentaire, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Governor Nelson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, there is a double standard at play here that should be pointed out. Well, the Bloc Party articulated quite well, much like the member just did, in terms of why it is postponing the date would have a negative impact on the province of Quebec because of the Quebec actual municipal elections. At the time when they first raised the issue, they weren't even aware that there was a municipal election taking place in the province of Alberta on the exact date of the next scheduled federal election. And when that was pointed out, when I pointed that out to the member in the Bloc Party, the response is, well, that's not our problem. We represent Quebec. Well, Madam Speaker, there are many members of Parliament that are national in their thinking. Many of them sit in the Alberta caucus in the Conservative ranks. And they seem to have completely forgotten that particular point. The Minister has made it very clear. He will support what it is that the committee has to propose. The NDP are proposing that we change the date. Mr. Speaker, we're open to ideas. Should we be respectful of the municipal election? Calgary and Edmonton having the same election. Imagine you live in Calgary, Edmonton, you're going to be going to vote for a mayor and a prime minister. You're members of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the question is, should we at least be open to the idea at the committee stage?
The Honourable Member. Mr. Speaker, all too often we've shown up a committee after voting for the principle of something, and then because of the Liberal majority, we were not able to present an amendment. Election legislation is too important for us to take that risk. So no, we can't trust people who have the gall to give us this type of legislation. It's twisted, and we will not trust people presenting something so twisted. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened closely to what my colleague had to say. He explained what's happening in Quebec very well. A federal election, then a few days later, a municipal election throughout Quebec and all municipalities. We saw what happened in 2021. we saw our municipal colleagues have to have an election at the same time as we did. It was very hard. People were bumping into each other while they were canvassing. But I have a question about the NDP. If the NDP were ready to overturn this government, we would be able to hold elections during the next few weeks, and that would be perfect. What does my colleague think of that? The honourable member from Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, this isn't a bill that would topple the government. But I would say to my colleague that I do want to make sure that Bill C-282, which is currently in the Senate and which is being blocked by Liberal and Conservative senators, even though everyone voted for it in the House, I would like that bill to come out to get through and help our farmers before the elections. I hope he agrees. The honourable member for Rosemont-Patry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague. I know how much he cares about matters of elections and democracy. We were on the Electoral Reform Committee together at the time when the Liberals were still pretending that they wanted a more democratic voting system. Of course, they have changed their ways since, changed their tune. And today, we know that this bill, by changing the date, would allow MPs to access their pension, certain MPs. We see that some of the Liberals might benefit, but actually, even though the Conservatives are criticizing them, most of the MPs that would benefit are actually Conservatives. There is a great deal of hypocrisy here. This bill isn't perfect, but I would ask my colleague, does he not agree that adding days for advanced voting, adding campus voting, adding more options for mail-in voting, isn't that all a step in the right direction? The honourable member from Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, as I indicated in my speech, I indicated that if that were the only thing in the bill, my position might have been different. But I would add that without a guarantee that indeed this twisted addition be removed from the bill, there is no question of going to committee because we don't know what will happen. We cannot support the bill. Now, in the legislation, there is the option for the Chief Electoral Officer to consider the fact that two elections are going to overlap. And that's important because I do trust the Chief Electoral Officer. I believe that he's impartial and has a logistical capacity to organize elections that are worthy of a parliamentary democracy.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, all I'm asking the member is to apply the same standards that he applies for the province of Quebec to the province of Alberta with respect to the election law. If the member is concerned about the municipal election in the province of Quebec, should he not at least be concerned about the municipal election in Alberta? It's an issue of fair treatment. You can still be a separatist in Quebec, but sympathetic to the democracy in other regions of the country.
Madame la députée de Montcalm.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Yes, Mr. Speaker, I've already said several times in this House that I am a sovereigntist, but I'm a sovereigntist because I fundamentally believe in the ideals of democracy, because the ideals of democracy are part of the idea of the sovereignty of nations, of peoples. So, indeed, I'm not against the idea of ensuring that the Alberta vote can happen properly. I agree that that's also important. Democracy is democracy wherever it happens. And we see that globally, by the way. We are fighting globally for democracy to be respected beyond borders. Thank you.
La députée de Calgary Shepherd.
I know this is a member from Quebec. Usually I would use French, but I just want to be clear to the Parliamentary Secretary for the Liberals who keeps raising this point, and I'd like to hear the members on this. I am an Alberta MP. The Local Authorities Elections Act in my province in Section 11 says that any municipality can move up its election to the Saturday before a federal or a provincial election. It's a non-issue, and it's a talking point the Liberals keep abusing in order to try and curry favour or to find some way to wedge the Bloc in its principled position on this bill. So I'd like to hear the member maybe perhaps think about this issue. The Liberals seem to want to use Alberta as a talking point, just the way they sometimes use his province as a talking point to further their political ambitions.
Député de Montcalm.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, I don't think this was a question for me. This was more of a comment on what the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader said.
Toujours, c'est des questions et des commentaires.
Well, it is questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Well, Mr. Speaker, my question. What was this government's justification for going from the 20th to the 27th? What was it? It had nothing to do with municipal elections. What they brought as a justification was that it was the Indian Festival of Lights. So my question for my colleague. I would like him to explain why religious festivals are being mixed up with the electoral process. The Honourable Member from Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, this is the elephant in the room. This is just a pretext. This government is inappropriately instrumentalizing religion for purely financial reasons. I expressed that earlier, and it's regrettable because it stokes the flames of cynicism towards politicians, and it affects everyone in this House.